On behalf of 24houranswers.com, I welcome you to today's lesson. In this video, we're going to look at finding maxima and minima, or referred to as maximums and minimums, graphically. Some textbooks refer to these as extrema, or some books refer to these as extremum. So a whole bunch of different names, they mean the same thing. However, two words to take note of. Those two words are relative and absolute. Those are different, and we will discuss that in this tutorial. So our example, consider f of x on the closed interval as given to the right. Find the relative maxima and minima as well as the absolute maxima and minima. Relative maximums and relative minimums cannot be endpoints. Absolute maximums and minimums may be endpoints, but relative maxima and minima, they will never be endpoints. By definition, check your textbook. It should mention it somewhere in there, but that's the important thing you want to take note of here. Now, what's the difference? Absolute, think about it like this. Absolute means the absolute highest point or the absolute lowest point, whether you're talking about maxima, highest, minima, lowest. So let's look at x equals 7 on this closed interval. Therefore, here's an endpoint and here's an endpoint. At this point, when x equals 7, we have a y value of 10, and visually, there is no higher point on this curve on this closed interval. Therefore, this is the absolute highest point. Therefore, we call it an absolute maximum, absolute maxima, or whatever vocabulary word you want to use here. So note here, the answer to this question is we have an absolute max of 10. The maximum value, the highest y value we have on this curve is 10. What about x equals 4? Now, relative maxima and minima, they cannot be endpoints. Now notice this point down here. When x equals 4, we have a y value of -7. Since the curve has no other y value that's lower than this, this is the absolute minimum. However, we can also call this a relative minimum as well, because it is the lowest point relative to the other points on the left side of it and the right side of it. Notice when I talk about relative, I'm talking about the left side of it and the right side of it. That's why we cannot have relative maximums or minimums at endpoints, because technically this maximum over here, we don't have a right side to it since it's the rightmost endpoint. This point here, we can't call it a relative max or a min because we don't have any dots to the left side of this leftmost endpoint. So at x equals 4, though, this is the absolute lowest point, but we can also call it a relative minimum as well. So notice our solution here. We have an absolute minimum and a relative minimum of -7 when x is equal to 4. Now, let's go and talk about when x is -1. Here we do have a hump, and this is a maximum, but it's not the absolute max because our absolute max was here. But this is a maximum relative to points that are close to it, both on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. Therefore, when x is -1, we have a relative maximum of 3. Now, also take note, when I talk about the maximum values or the minimum values, we are actually referring to the y value, but it occurs at a particular x value. Don't get those two mixed up. And then last but not least, let's look when x is equal to -3. This is the leftmost endpoint. Now, this is not the absolute minimum because there's clearly plenty of other points that are lower than this left endpoint. And as a matter of fact, we've already labeled our absolute minimum. Therefore, since this is not an absolute minimum and endpoints cannot be relative maxes or mins, at x equals -3, all we have is a left endpoint. So notice our solution here. We have no absolute max or min because clearly we said this one over here. We definitely have some lower points and we definitely have some higher points than this one. And since an endpoint cannot be a relative max or min, we don't have a relative max or min at -3. All we have here is a left endpoint. And there you have it, graphically looking at relative maxes and relative mins as well as absolute maxes and absolute mins. We will look at the calculus techniques in a future tutorial. And that's it for this video. I hope it helped. Be sure to check out our YouTube channel for more videos. Links to our social media are in the description below.